In this talk, I will explore the role of memory and the ethics of strategic forgetting in a future imaginary that wishes to shift the narrative of power, extraction, and commerce to a narrative of collaboration, curiosity, and exchange. The first part of the presentation, I will tell a story. In the second part of the presentation, I will introduce you to the Arrivals Legacy project. That is a process that I've been developing for over 20 years. So I'll start with the story. In the story, I will set up an ethical dilemma. By interrogating the role of memory and a strategic forgetting, I ask the questions, what are the benefits of strategically forgetting? What are the implications for future generations who might not choose to forget? This is the story. It is 2251. For the past 85 years, there has been lasting and meaningful peace amongst the global nations. All Western governing bodies have been replaced by the Seventh World Indigenous Transoceanic Coalition Hub, or SWITCH. SWITCH is a depoliticized network of citizens made up of indigenous nations in what was once called the developing world, who formed an alliance with indigenous communities in the Americas, supported by the World Associated Diaspora of Color Coalition, or WADOCO. After the Great Sickness, there was a collapse of the United States government following the ultimate impeachment of the President of the United States in 2021. At the same time, the vote of no confidence in the parliamentary system in Canada in 2022 and the collapse of the European Union in 2025 birthed a new governing structure entitled SWITCH. SWITCH, which had been operating as an underground network of concerned revolutionaries, were well placed to step up to create a new leadership network that truly represented the people. SWITCH's campaign was simple. Instead of "we the people for the people," or "the people have spoken and time's up," all effective mainstream campaigns of refusal, SWITCH's strategy of silent refusal, fueled by an ethos of grounded realism, made their powerful message undeniable. Our grandmothers have spoken, and we will not rest until they rest. Going beyond a mere slogan or campaign promise, SWITCH's message was backed up by well-articulated action plans to bring about world peace by returning and exchanging traditional ways of knowing, being fueled by their governing value of kinship. This was a movement that was well overdue, brought into existence from an organized global state of refusal to participate in all forms of dominance, disguised as democracy. With the collapse of the other political structures and the growing outcry for dwindling resources, SWITCH was elected as the new governing body in an historic landslide vote in 2026. After a rocky start, riding the wave of white fragility in its many forms, SWITCH found its feet, and the SWITCH movement has been growing and functioning for almost 200 years. Founded in the shared traditional values of kinship, autonomy, communality, reflexivity, truth, and responsibility, the primary mission of SWITCH is to restore the principles of peace and collaboration in all areas of development. I'll just wait till the truck goes by. Okay. Founded in the shared traditional values of kinship, autonomy, communality, reflexivity, truth, and responsibility, The primary mission of Switch is to restore the principles of peace and collaboration in all areas of development, including trade, governance, national and international and intergalactic travel, education, arts, communication, social progress, and environmental futures. The central priority of Switch is to advocate for environmental sovereignty at all costs. In other words, to give back to Mother Earth the resources she needs to restore herself. In response to the Switch governing body's new Environmental Policy Agreement, or NEPA, Mother Earth had begun to repair herself in 2033 and is today 98% restored. With governing leadership hubs around the world, the Switch Interdisciplinary Research Center has developed an advanced communication technology that encourages collective decision-making that is generative for each home community and the communities they collaborate with. This technology was developed by representative scholars, artists, engineers, and digital communications specialists drawn from every region of the world. Through collaborative study of the surviving North, Central, and South American petroglyphs, African cave paintings, and Latinx indigenous codices, the working group rediscovered a generative way to tap into the Earth's core as a mediating force for decision-making. They discovered a specific frequency emerged generated by the movement of healing dancers, North American indigenous powwow dances, the Hawaiian hula, the Garifuna Punta dance, the Maori haka, the Congolese zabula, the Palestinian dabka, and the Aztec ritual dance Calpulli. I don't know how to pronounce this word. Sorry. And the Aztec ritual dance, in dialogue with specifically calibrated drum rhythmic patterns and vocal frequencies. The working group discovered that the specifically chosen patterns enacted as a global ritual would activate a chain reaction between the heated core and the movement of the tectonic plates, providing an unprecedented energy burst that would not only heal the core, but that could also be harnessed into a communication system for decision-making. This ritual offering in my Garifuna language is called Darunyabenya. In English, it is called the open door. It is challenging to describe the exact processes here to such a lay audience, as I am not an engineer, nor am I a bouye or sacred teacher, but suffice it to say, this discovery had a major impact on the success of the Switch initiative as it provided a globally responsive foundation for achieving what we all hoped for, a true meeting of the minds. A side effect of this technology, however, was discovered over 50 years ago. Creative technologists discovered that very particular negative memories were being erased, those of anti-Black and brown racism, and the effects of this was felt in all areas of society. During the first signs of erasure, it was decided that this was an acceptable loss, as it seemed to create a lightness of being, especially amongst Black and brown peoples. Freed up from the impediments of their colonial pasts, they thrived, and the rest of the world thrived as a result. As these memories faded from the psyches of the people, so did violence against Black and brown peoples, war, and criminal intent. Although things weren't perfect, there was a measured improvement. 50 years later, while much has progressed, a few anomalies have begun to emerge. Although the memories of Black and brown racism have been completely wiped from the consciousness of at least 2 generations, we are finding that latent memories are resurfacing in less than positive ways. Some psychic fissures are causing these latent memories to slip through the cracks and manifest in disturbing ways. We are attempting to address this through an integrated arts movement that allows those impacted by these latent memories an outlet for expression. The Codex Project Exchange, or COPE, will, we hope, serve as a healing tool to restore what has been lost. Chicana cultural, queer, and feminist theorist Gloria Anzaldúa speaks about the nouveaux concept of Nepantla. She describes it in this way: living between cultures results in seeing double, first from the perspective of one culture, then from the perspective of another. Seeing from two or more perspectives simultaneously renders those cultures transparent. Removed from that culture's center, you glimpse the sea in which you've been immersed, but to which you were oblivious, no longer seeing the world the way you see it. For Anzaldúa, Nepantla is terra incognita, and living in this liminal zone means being in a constant state of displacement, an uncomfortable, even alarming feeling. Poet and cultural critic Amnor Bessie Phillip offers that to strip a people of the gift of their culture is a double act of inhumanity for both the victim and the perpetrator, who is also the victim. In the story, I chose to explore a future imaginary released from the baggage of colonial shame in order to interrogate the benefits and ethics of strategic forgetting. As the story continues, I introduce an unnamed protagonist who is responsible for the violent restoration of memories to those who had been born into the natural state of forgetting. She has been called by the governing council to account for her actions. While she is remorseful about having unleashed a world of pain, she is also of the belief that she was also under the belief that her and her colleagues' actions were necessary and justifiable. Unconsciously drawing on the power of Philip's warning that we must not forget neither the oppressor nor the victim, not Canada or the Indigenous person, the African or the Asian. To forget would be tantamount to engaging in massive and collective social amnesia. So in this story, I interrogate the ethics of strategic forgetting, shifting between what Philip would name the dynamics of belonging and becoming. Ilala, la legeli, ilala, la legeli, ileaye, ileayo, ileaye, ileayo, ilala, la legeli. Part 2. There is no bypassing loss. What are the legacies we carry, and what do we leave behind? Founded in 2003 as a creative engagement tool for displaced Indigenous and migrant artists and communities, the Arrivals Legacy Project is designed to unearth embodied root cultural practices and authentic creative impulses through ancestral connections. The strength of the Arrivals process lies in its application as a story generating and community development tool to ignite, negotiate, and reconcile diverse perspectives. I'm just gonna share my screen and start the slideshow. It has proven itself, the Arrivals process has proven itself to be a powerful initiator and a developer of collaborative artistic creations that address transdisciplinary, intergenerational, and cross-cultural concerns. The Arrivals process enacts an approach to collaborative responsibility that is geared toward particular centers of gravity that are rooted in the body and infused by the spirit. As a result, the process itself demands a level of engagement that contradicts the traditional role of the artist or researcher as knowledge producer by asking them to step into a state of unknowing and to grapple with what is potentially unknowable. As participants and co-facilitators, we strip ourselves down to face, experience, and embody our own ancestral legacies and mythologies while deeply witnessing this process in others. The practice of deep witnessing implicates us in each other's stories, causing us to sneak under each other's borders and to compassionately entangle ourselves in the histories or legacies that might otherwise divide us. Through arrivals, we draw on our individual and collective ancestries and journey towards arriving at the discovery or the recovery of root cultural practices as a creative storehouse for cultural production. In this presentation, I navigate between my voice as an artist and researcher to construct a profile of the Arrivals Legacy Project as a viable tool for addressing the ruptures caused by migration, forced or otherwise, and for creating new epistemologies or legacies of knowing that might inspire a future imaginary that is rooted in the past but not bound by it. I will first introduce you to the work and philosophy behind the Arrivals Legacy Project. In the second part, well, this will happen actually in the workshop, we will present the key building blocks that have emerged from the process, which have become guiding principles for interdisciplinary and cross-cultural collaboration. Introducing our body, including our mind, body, voice, breath, and spirit, in or as a creative village, we will discover tools to bring our emerging stories, memories, gestures, and movements to life in the village circle. We carry a legacy. There is no bypassing loss, the loss of language, culture, dance, songs, history, memory, home. For those who remain, there is a continual longing for a forgotten past. For those who leave, there exists a sometimes unspoken longing to return. Loss in the context of ancestral exile adds another layer of complication with a deliberate suppression of memory as a strategy for survival. Haitian historian Jean-Michel Trouillot says, silences enter the process of historical production at 4 crucial moments: the moment of fact creation, the making of sources, the moment of fact assembly, the making of archives, the moment of fact retrieval, the making of narratives, and the moment of retrospective significance, the making of history in the final instance. When speaking of archival knowledges and holdings, Trouillot asked the questions, how do we recognize the end of a bottomless silence? There are stories mingled in our blood, buried in bones and breath, stories waiting to be told. Our bodies naturally make images consciously and unconsciously. This is not only for communication, but in response to our environment, our history and experience, our needs and desires. When we create story from these images, we increase our ability to see and capture them in space and time. If we recognize indigeneity linked to water as well as earth, how does that change the language of ownership or one's sense of rootedness? Diane Brand reminds us that the door of no return, transformed us into bodies emptied of being, bodies emptied of self-interpretation into which new interpretations could be placed. The African storyteller has often been described as a chameleon. Sing out the tempo of Loketo, turn left, Then right, they change with the shape of each story by bending themselves in service. The ability to adapt one's essence, one's very being, can have both positive and negative implications. What if, for example, the story carries you across the ocean against your will in the dank and dark hold of a vessel headed for a new world, for example? Adapting to this story might require you to actively and forcefully forget, minimizing the horrors of the dehumanizing journey. In this crossing, the chameleon story may have become the vessel, the hold, the rats, the stagnating excrement plastering the floors and walls, and yet suppressing the screams they will speak of rivers, suppressing the stench, the whip, the oppressor's fist and dick, and still they will rise. Forgetting in the new world becomes not only a strategy for survival, but a rite of passage. My father's crossing from St. Vincent to South Wales on the SS Madalena was an easier one. His journey was by choice. A runner and high jumper for the Commonwealth Games, he left home. Filled with hopes for the future, he left the land, his family, his friends, and all that he knew to learn more, to grow, to forge a new path, leaving home and inadvertently erasing home. And my story picks up in Canada, curious about crossings and lives lived there and then, in residues and conjecture, searching through past and unexpected clues found on the land I now call home. I imagine the there and then in the here and now. At times, the worlds feel far apart, the answers unreachable. The context for the Arrival's legacy work is, has been, and will continue to be the colonized body. And although I begin from a personal contextual framework, the Arrival's personal legacy process in its development reveals its universal application for cultural reclamation. We are living legacies. We gather, deposit, and imprint residues in every interaction with our past, our present, and the world around us. The motivation behind Arrivals comes from many years of witnessing the profound disconnect that so many racialized artists in North America experience about ourselves, our environment, and our cultural histories. One cannot discount as a contributing factor the lingering effects of colonization, migration, and the forces of assimilation. For Afrosporic peoples, this alienation is compounded by anti-Black racism, violence, and the deracination of our contributions to modern culture. We carry a legacy. When we carry our own weight, we carry our full potential. When we put ourselves into a situation where and when our creative bodies, breath and voice and mind can thrive, a state of letting go, we begin to tap into an abundant source of inspiration. In the environmental movement, we learn to reduce our carbon footprint. In ceremony, we learn that we must deepen our footprint, step fully into our stories, and let them unfold around us. Poet laureate Derek Walcott speaks of the roughly hewn beauty of our inherited fragmentation as Antillean peoples. Break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than that love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. If the pieces are disparate, ill-fitting, they contain more pain than their original sculpture, those icons and sacred vessels taken for granted in their ancestral places. At the center of this process is the acknowledgement that everything we need to draw on for inspiration is stored in our bodies as stories and fragments of stories, mingled in our blood, buried in our bones. In the performer's village, the witness is as important as the performer, and there are several layers to witnessing. As witnesses and performers, you are in the village circle witnessing yourselves, your fellow villagers, and the shifting and changing environment around you as you collectively move closer to the creative fire. Through the Arrival's legacy process, we collectively and individually reclaim gestures that give us a sense of knowing, the wisdom of embodied archives in dialogue with written archives. We consider the process of landing. We witness ourselves through our chosen ancestor who, in their process of landing, might reconstruct new identities. Tiffany Lethabo King proposes that all bodies are always already embedded in and run conterminously with human life. She draws on Leanne Simpson's belief that our bodies are embedded in the ecologies and in our intimate relationships with the land. In the Arrivals process, we trace ruptured knowings and develop new ways of seeing ourself in another, ourself in another's land, and through this, we lean into the possibility of weaving a new kind of knowing. I propose that as we navigate our constant state of betweenness or betweenity, as poet Norbesi Philip has coined it, we gain new insights into our relationship to land. This is particularly important in the context of Indigenous land claims and the global call for reparations. I'm going to stop there with just one final thought. We uncover what we need to navigate our root cultural traditions. We recall and engage with our inherited practices and find, create, or discover new practices that address our contemporary and ancient longing for connection. In our need to navigate conflicting cultural protocols, we find ourselves uncovering deeper truths, translating them from contemporary gestures into ceremonies and rites of passage. Ilala la lukeli, ilala la lukeli. There are stories under skin, mingled in blood, buried in bones and breath. We are called to carry these stories, to deepen our footprints, and to provide a clear path for those that follow. So that is my talk. There were a few questions that, just going to go to that document. There were a few questions that I guess I was invited to interrogate when I first presented this paper at a conference that was called African Atlantic Futures. Some of these questions that came forward, and perhaps Robin, you can put them into the chat. They're in the Google Doc. Just gonna make this full screen. So the questions were how oral and ritual performance forms impact, shape, record, and encode memory in the context of colonial violence. How does post-colonial memory call into question the social deployment of memory within the nation and across nations? And what does any of this have to do with radiant power? So I thought we could just have a chat if anybody has any initial thoughts or questions. And
Everyone should be able to unmute themselves at this point.
Just have a chat if anybody has any initial thoughts or I just was reading questions and I had that Stefan Martelli, who is one
Everyone should be able to.
Oh,
oops.
Oh, sorry. I feel like I'm talking over somebody, or is it my own voice?
There's an echo of sorts.
Oh, okay.
Huh. One moment. So Stefan asked a question in the chat.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. About your initial story. I'm surprised and perplexed that violent memories would still come up in a post-colonial future. Or it's a comment.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting comment. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to start to say thank you for your beautiful presentation. But yes, I am perplexed. I wonder if you want to talk a bit about that. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting notion. This story, the story that I read, I wrote for a class that I took called Indigenous Futures, which was led by Jason Lewis. When I was trying to think of what my final project would be, I knew I wanted to speak about a future okay, first of all, let me back up a second. It was actually a really challenging assignment for me because I couldn't understand how to imagine a future beyond anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism.
Yeah.
And in the Garifuna story, there's I won't go into the ins and outs of it, but in the Garifuna story itself, there is a real deep identity crisis historically embedded in the birth of the Garifuna peoples. They were born as Black Caribs in St. Vincent. They were actually Caribs. They were Caribs. But when the British came to St. Vincent, they wanted the land that the so-called Black Caribs had. So they decided to make a distinction between the red and the Black Caribs. And in that campaign of distinguishing between red and Black, of course, the Black Caribs were savage, were unacculturated. I mean, both the red and Black Caribs in the British view were considered savages, but there were better savages and lesser savages, right? So, so that sense of identity of not being Indigenous, not being African, but being sort of between the two cultures has been something that has been handed down. And so when I was trying to imagine this future, I kept bumping up against this sort of internal struggle that hasn't been, or it has been my own struggle, but I feel that it's an ancestral struggle of identity. So I wanted to address that in this story. I wanted to address and face head on this idea of Black and brown, or anti-racism and racism, Black and brown, anti-Black and brown racism, still existing, but also being forgotten and wiped out. So in some ways, the future, it had been wiped out, but it had been wiped out as a memory. And it had been wiped out as almost a healing practice that happened in relationship to the earth. So it was a natural occurrence that happened as we started to make a right relationship with the environment and with each other. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, it does. It's very interesting because it makes it more complex.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it really a lot more complex, almost like as if there cannot be a complete imagination of freedom if initially, when you're talking about the origin story of the Garifuna people, if initially there is maybe not a myth of this freedom at the origins, maybe.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's very, it gives me a lot to think about. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment.
There's a question in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen the destruction of colonial statues, yet does this not destroy the needed memories and history of anti-racism that we need not to forget?
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting question. I think that's a living debate right now within many circles, whether or not this is an erasure of memory or whether or not it's an opening or an opportunity for new memories, because the absence of those statues and the destruction of those statues becomes a new memory and a new discussion, I think, because how many of those statues have we walked by and not even noticed and not even really taken into account, you know, how they are, what their impact is, that we've taken them for granted. But now there's movement. You know, literally, there's movement in the statues. There's an interaction with the statues that then causes the needed conversations that that really need to be unearthed, that have been buried, I think, under those colonial statues for so long. So I think it's a really great question that I think we should all continually keep speaking about. But I think there's something in the idea of these stories that are buried under these statues and that have been buried for so long.
But if I could say something.
Yes, please.
If you're living in a certain region for 20, 30, 40 years, and you're aware of the history of a certain statue or monument that is, you know, is repulsive, let's say. Use for an example, the controversy over the Confederate statues that are happening right now in the States. The removal of them does something psychologically and agentially to those people who are aware of the history. So it's not necessarily, well, not entirely that it's doing something to memory. It is doing something to memory or forgetting or remembering. I'm not sure how to frame that, but if you're aware that your community acknowledges that there is something repugnant about this statue being on display, glorified day to day for 30, 40 years, and finally they remove it, then it's a positive. You know, it's and the relations that you will have with the space, will have maybe with the people in that space, with the community, will change the better. So I'm not sure about the, like, in terms of what it would do for the memories, like in terms of what we're discussing regarding colonial statues, but for people who are like highly conscious of their history and the representation of the statue, why it was put there, who it was commissioned by, makes a difference if it's removed or taken down, and something else, something more more community focused and more altruistically, like something that could be altruistically celebrated, is put up instead. That's my 2 cents worth.
Thank you.
I take a different perspective, if I can speak.
Please, please.
I think that the oppressor needs to confront that sculpture as much as that sculpture has oppressed and represents the oppression of others. I have to tell you, I come from a country, my entire country was built by slaves. I'm Italian. And the Colosseum and all those lovely things you see when you go to Italy were made by slaves. Christians, Jews, Blacks, whoever. And what has happened in Europe in many places is that they've empowered the history and the experience and the memories of what those sculptures and those, some cases even institutions, buildings, and what they represent, so that we take responsibility. Because the problem, when you consider that Indigenous people and Black people are a minority, as are migrants and many others in Canadian society, that it's the majority culture that needs to remember as well what their history means. And I feel that that would provide a unity of purpose and a greater humanity if we could achieve this. That's my feeling. That's what happens when you take a tour of the Colosseum today. You're not just going to watch and be given, I don't know, some architectural thing. You're going to be given the history of how it was made and who made it, and how it was possible that the Roman Empire survived on the backs of slaves. So that is my experience, my memory. And I'm very thankful to have that history, because it becomes a part of my memory and coming back and coming here to this country when being Italian was not white enough, you know, in those days. So that's how my perspective may be, because I come from a different place in the world. And so I look at these things. Destruction, I'm very hesitant about destruction. That bothers me somehow, that somehow we should be able to use this in expressing the pain and the joy of knowing, because there's joy in being and having knowledge, of having acquired knowledge about our past. There's joy in that. And I'm thankful that every day I have, I acquire more and more history of people who have been oppressed the world over. And I think of the world in that way when I see it.
Thank you.
But as you say, I think we have to, it just circles this discussion about the sculptures and history and what is it that we can destroy in order to forget? And yeah, maybe other memories can be created by that destruction. But I look at the dominant culture and I look at the majority culture, and they have to accept and recognize the
Yeah.
sins of our ancestors. I mean, what can I say? It's a fact. You
Yeah.
can't ignore that and sort of sweep it underneath the carpet, you know?
Yeah, thank you for
I
that. I think thank you. Please go ahead. Nadia, or was somebody going to?
have a fan. I guess I'm curious, like, can you hear me?
Yes,
Oh,
I think there's a delay.
yeah, sorry. Okay. Connection is what you make it, and I recognize imagination as a powerful tool, one that both sets us free and binds us. And I wondered if you could speak about how it's used and harnessed in the Arrival's legacy work. And particularly, I'm curious to know what limits there are in the realm of make-believe, or whether it all becomes a sort of truth in this work.
Oh, that's such a great question. Yeah, I think that the sort of oscillation between imagination and finding, seeking truths is pretty key to the process. Many people that have gone through the process experience, as yourself, I know, I don't know if I can out you as being a past participant, an alumni of the process, Nadia, but many people have spoken about trying to find, well, the challenges of trying to find these hidden truths about their ancestry, or also about their root cultures, truths that have been severed along the way, because in many ways the dominant sort of historical story is much more present than the stories of the ancestors of Indigenous people and racialized people. So finding those stories can be, in and of itself, frustrating, but also incredibly rewarding process of deep diving. And so in that deep diving, there's this movement between what we imagine might have happened in the past with our ancestor. We ask these questions that aren't just about facts and moments in time, but are about emotional states of being, and things come up in our bodies where we say, well, I start to feel in the same way that my ancestor might have felt in a particular compelling moment in time. And so I imagine that, and I imagine, what if I were in that position, in that moment in time? And I start to, these memories or story bits come alive in our bodies and start to emerge. And then as we start to put the pieces together between the knowledge that we're receiving from speaking to our family or looking into the archives, and the knowledge that is emerging from our bodies, there are direct connections that start to come about, that start to. And so your question about the limits of imagination, there's a moment in the work where people often ask or have a concern about misrepresenting their ancestor, about not telling the right story, or dishonoring their ancestor by imagining the what if I was in that position. But when we move past that initial kind of worry about the dishonoring, we start to develop a relationship with our ancestor, which causes, and in that relationship, there's a conversation that can happen that brings up and brings back the memories that may or may not have happened. You know what I mean? Like, so it's like, I imagine the there and then in my story. I say, I imagine the there and then in the here and now. And then I find something, a little nugget of something that says, what I imagined makes so much sense, because I've just found the proof of that in somebody else's story about the ancestor. So there's this really interesting movement between fact, memory, imagination, that happens, that makes it a fluid process. And so we're not necessarily trying to tell the details of our ancestor, but we're telling the details of ourselves and how our ancestors live in our body and how our ancestors continue to live in and speak through who we are, but also our relationships, who we are in the relationships, because this work is often done within the relationship of a village. So it's not just about me and my ancestor, but it's me and my ancestor and you and your ancestor. And then your ancestor and my ancestor who have never probably met or even had the opportunity to meet. So there's these different planes of playgrounds that sort of exist, you know, within the village that is in the room, within the village that is in the ancestral plane, and the village which I also think of the ancestors on the territory within which we are working, who are also witnessing the work that we're doing. So it can become a beautiful imaginary that is full of truth. And you know, truth plus. Does that make sense? Yeah. Does that answer what you were asking?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it does, because in one way, what I hear from your answer is that it all becomes a sort of truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You,
Hi, I'm sorry, can I go ahead with a comment?
Please.
Hi, Diane. It's Edith. Thank you for your presentation. It's the second time that I have the occasion to hear you on the Arrivals project, Legacy project. And once again, I get back to that phrase that you have, which is like, how do we, like, what do we carry with us and what do we leave behind? Which like really amazed me the first time and still does. And now you add this idea of the footprint. And you know, I received these elements or these ideas or concepts from my own background and my own weight, and I'm questioning about like how these ideas can at the same time unite us among white and racialized people, and how also like there are still like, of course, divisions, and I feel them a lot in the footstep or the footprint idea, because you were mentioning this environmental footprint that we say that a lot among white ecologists, that we have to reduce that footprint all the time, but it's not the same. I mean, our footprints are not the same historically. They're like hugely different, and I can hear that also in the different comments that were about the destruction or the preservation of the monuments, because some people need to carry the weights that they historically didn't want to. That's the way that I feel about myself. And some people have been carrying our weight, like the weight of white people, over and over again. And that's the case of people who have, like racialized people who have to live with the monuments of colonialist, colonial heritage. So yeah, I don't know where to go from there, but maybe you would like to comment on those like cleavages, like between different us, and how we can move from those cleavage to some other kinds of relationships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a big question. I mean, I think that's that. I mean, that is sort of the hope of this work, is to find those moments of connectivity that that allow us, what I talk about, sneaking onto each other's borders. That we're not in that place where we're having these conversations that are often up here somewhere, and we're trying to work it out from our brains. But what is it that our bodies are telling us, and how do we get to that place of the deeper questions? When I talk about that idea of the footprint, and in ceremony, there's a deepening of our footprint. So there's not this sense of being, we're not reactive. We're not being reactive, but we're inside. Does that make sense? We're kind of inside the process, inside the conversation. And I can only sort of think of it at that that moment when I sort of wrote that. I was in St. Vincent, and I was actually stepping on the land with my, I think I have a picture of my foot. We were near the petroglyphs in St. Vincent, and there was something really magical about the land around that. And so I took a picture of my foot in the earth. And I started thinking about this idea of, this footprint and the deepening of my footprint. And what does it mean if I'm really making myself aware of my feet on the earth and the relationship between my feet and the earth below? What does that mean? And I think it's an open question. Like, I don't even know if I have an answer, but if and maybe we'll explore this in the workshop, but this idea of being sort of in complete relationship to the environment, where does that take us then? Like, where does that take us? And I think the unknown is really important in that moment, because I don't even know how to describe it. I don't know. I can't really predict and say, okay, then we come to a deeper sense of truth and see each other more. But we have to actually do it. We have to be there. We have to deepen that footprint, and we have to be there with each other. And then what? And then be in the and then what? Does that make sense, or do I just sound like a flake?
Yes, no, it completely does. But yeah, of course, the question is like so vast. But the idea of presence and possibility of presence through ceremony, yeah, certainly has a role to play with that, because we retreat, or we hide a lot behind discourses, especially in the intellectual or artistic sphere as well, like hiding behind images, behind discourses, and these discourses can become like fences of their own, I think.
Right. It's interesting. Looking at this comment. Myrna. Okay. Where are we, Robin?
I'm going to put my video back on. Is it back?
Yes, back.
I mean, I think we could take one or two more questions if there's anyone who has a final question or comment.
Diane?
Yes.
I want to really thank you for your talk, because there's a lot of your presentation is really rich, and it touches on a lot of different things in my life. and I just wanted to, and also your voice is very relaxing, including your singing. You don't sound like a flake. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think, this is going to be maybe like as you know, a dumb question, but what do you think could happen in that unknown space? Like, we're here together, we acknowledge that this is wrong, this is good, this is where we should, you know, go forward, this is what we should go forward with. But then in the unknown, there's also maybe a fear that things will recur, trauma will recur, colonization, you know, because then there's a limit to what humans can do. So how do you envision the unknown in like a hopeful way? What do you see maybe happening with the rest of your narrative, let's say in the year 3000? And while you're thinking about that, I just wanted to clarify that my earlier comment about the statues is not to destroy them. There's a few in Montreal that are really irritating to me. And I think it would be good to remove them, but not necessarily destroy them. I think maybe they could be put in a museum and contextualized. But I'm not really for their destruction because they're historical artifacts and we learn from those artifacts. So anyway.
I mean, it's a really, really rich question that I don't think I can answer. But something that I will think through, just what the unknown can look like. And I think by definition, we don't know. We don't know. And just this imaginary of being able to sort of shed all of the things that separate us. In my story, it was anti-Black and brown racism. But imagine the possibilities. But I think, I think the unknown is a really exciting place. Yes, there's the potential for it to go sideways and for things to recur and repeat, but I think it's an exciting place to imagine this. Does anybody else have any ideas? Oh, wow. It's a really great question.
I would like to, did someone else open their mic? I'd be curious to hear a bit more on different sides of betweenness, and then you drew from the Bessie Phillip betweenity. Is that how you said it? Was it betweenity? Yeah, betweenity. And it is mentioned fences, and different points you mentioned borders and getting under the borders. Early on in your talk, you spoke about sneaking under each other's borders. So I would just be curious to hear a few other angles on your thoughts on betweenness. Because there's a commonality that comes with betweenness, but there's also interruption and boundaries and barriers. And again, Gideon had mentioned fences, and we spoke about obstacles. And so these different ways of working with being in states of in between, both in terms of like a sense of hybridity or a sense of division, but also just literally having things wedged in between.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, it does relate to that unknown question as well. It's sort of living with, well, biculturally or polyculturally, it's living within those cultures and trying to navigate the who am I within that. But there's also, and there's a between the here and there, when I talked about the here and there, or the here and then, and the there and now, there's and the idea of these legacies that we inherit, including the dominant legacies, but also the legacies that we inherit. So there's a betweenity between who we are today and the legacies that we carry with us. And then the sense of belonging, I guess, that's where Norbesi Philip speaks about this idea of betweenity, is in this sense of belonging, where I've read and heard her speak of belong here, belonging here, belong here, but not really here because of this sense of being inside and outside of the culture that one is sort of living and growing in. Yeah, and I think that the navigating those states of different beingness is what she's getting at in that idea of betweenity. And that also exists within the arrivals work as well. This navigation of self and the different types of self that we carry into the process. I'm starting to sort of make the connection between the previous question about the unknown and how do we then step into that place with all of these fissures, I guess, of knowing and unknowing, and this sort of undoing of one's knowledge as well, which happens often in the process, the undoing of assumptions, the undoing of knowledges that we think that we bring to the process, but then are overturned within us through the process and through the interaction with our ancestor and with each other. The work itself, I talked about the different levels of witnessing in the work, because in the work, the way that we set it up is that we witness each other's stories and each other's journeys, and we learn that process. There's a training that happens to learn this process of deep witnessing. So how do I witness the story in you, and that might be emerging in you, and witness it in an ethical and a way that I can see things without trying to impose my own story on it. So there's a betweenity or between this. There's a relationship between you and me, and also the story that's emerging out of you and that I'm able to receive. And I need to learn how to catch those stories. We talk about catching the story fragments without imposing. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but it got me moving in different directions.
I mean,
Yeah. Could I follow up? Just, sorry. What you were just describing, hi Diane, and what you've been doing is just so beautiful and moving. And you've mentioned the importance of the body in this work, and I wanted to go in further, if you could, it's always very hard, I think, to talk about what the body does, right, in this kind of work. But if you could, because I'm really interested in this like deep witnessing that you're talking, I think that's a key part of processes of healing if we are to think about how to live together, right? And acknowledge these histories of suffering that have made the societies that we inhabit, right, and how we undo that. And so if you could speak a bit more about how in this in the processes of the arrival legacies, how that deep witnessing is embodied and happens through feeling, right, and or movement, or I don't know, you'll have more things to say about that, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are different parts of the process where one person will be exploring their story physically, and the other person will be sitting and watching and catching story bits. And so part of the training is about learning to see the body cues. So it's breath, learning to look for shifts in breath. It's learning to look for the gestures that may emerge that may be involuntary or may come out of a particular prompt that I, as a facilitator, might give, and how to catch that. So I raise my hand like this, and you see me raise my hand like this. So you, as a witness, you say, I see you raise your hand like this, because that's an important thing for me to remember, because I might not remember it. So you see me raise my hand like this, but then there's something that awakens in you where in the palm of my hand, you see a light. So you say that, I see a light glowing in the palm of her hand, and what happens then? And from there, so that when we start to reconstruct the story of this exploration, we are reconstructing it from the outside witness and the person who was inside the process. And as I'm inside the process, I know that you're witnessing me. I know that I'm being seen. So I feel that I can do what I need. My body feels a sense of freedom being held in the space. So I can then listen more deeply. I don't have to be thinking on the outside and thinking, oh, what does this look like? Or what's happening now? Or how am I going to remember that? But there's a deep trust between you and the witness that's built up as we go through the process of the workshop. So that we learn to also to witness inside our own bodies. We learn how to find and follow the impulses that come to life, the little fires that start to be lit, and we follow them, and we follow the light of those fires, and we move, and we explore, and we hit a wall, and we breathe, and we see what comes next. So that unknown, so it speaks to the other questions about the unknowns and the between as well. And we're still here. I'm still here. I'm still very much aware that I'm in this space. And I'm still very much aware that I'm being seen, being witnessed. But I'm also very much aware that I'm being witnessed on a deeper level, on an inside place. So it's kind of that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful. And like the importance of having someone else witnessing allows for your own deep engagement, right? It's, yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your engagement and your questions and your attention this afternoon. I think Diane's been speaking for an hour and a half now, and you've been listening and engaging for an hour and a half now. Diane, do you have any final comments or words?
No, this has been such a joy, such a joy to be able to engage with you all. Yeah, I've been. I was expressing to Robin how this work is so much about being in the same room and being, in communion with people, to be able to breathe together, to be able to hold each other, and to try to imagine how this work goes forward in this context, in this digital context, is a real challenge. Yeah. So I look forward to the workshop for those of you who will come next week, and we'll see what the experiment reveals.
Excellent. So anyone who is interested in the workshop, you can email me at robin.simpson@concordia.ca. That information is also on our website. And like I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of a 3-part series, Puissance, irradiante, radiant power. And each of the sessions is similar to this in the sense that there is first a public presentation and discussion followed by a workshop. So later in October, there will be a presentation by Landscape of Hope, who are a social pedagogy group based here out of Concordia University. And then at the end of November, it will be Natalie Hunter-Young, who is a visual culture scholar based in Toronto. And I also mentioned that this program was put together in anticipation of and to run in parallel with François Lemieux and Edith Brunet's exhibition, and they're both here in the room. And their exhibition will be opening at the gallery in person, on site, on October 7th. So you can find more information about that on our website. And of course, I encourage you to sign up for our social media to receive notification of upcoming events. So thank you again, everyone, for your participation. And we hope to see you at more of our virtual events, and then eventually in person more and more frequently in the future. Take care. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.